Today our topic of concern is to study scope of variables. Outline of today's lecture is to define scope of a variable, local variable and global variable. We are going to understand what is local variable, what is global variable, what they are used for, what they actually do. What is scope? Scope is nothing but a lifetime, or you can say lifetime of a variable. We can also say that the area under which a variable is applicable or alive is called scope. Suppose we have a function called main, and inside this function I've declared a variable called var. Now the scope of this variable, if we want to define, this is within that function only. That means its lifetime is within that function, and if some other function which is outside the main function tries to access this variable, then it won't be able to do that because it is not visible outside its block. That is what we called as a scope of that variable. So we can say this variable var scope is within that main function only, and it is not available outside this main function. That is what we called as a scope. In a stricter sense, we can say that a scope is nothing but a block or a region where a variable is declared, defined and used. And when a block or a region ends, variable is automatically destroyed. Now this is something which we need to know. When this particular block, or you can say suppose main function is completed its execution, then after completion of its execution, variable is automatically destroyed as well. Suppose the main function completes its execution, then after that when we call this function again, then inside variable is also created again. The variable which was previously created is destroyed when the function completes its execution. That is why a variable is called an automatic variable, because it automatically destroys after the function completes its execution. Okay, here you can see I have defined a main function. Inside this main function I have defined a variable and assigned it a value 34. And if we try to print this variable inside this main function, we can do so because this variable is available within this main function only. And this variable is local to main function. Because this variable is available within this main function, that is why we call this variable as a local variable to this main function. Let's suppose I have defined another function called fun, and inside this function I used a printf function to print the variable var. Now as we know, if we try to print this variable var, we won't be able to do that, because this variable is trying to access the variable which is inside this main function block. And this is not allowed. This variable is not visible to this function. Therefore, it will not be able to print this variable, you can say. And it will produce an error, which is variable undeclared. That is what we called as a scope, right? Because this variable scope is within that function, it is not available to this, it will produce an error. Let's try to understand some basic principles of scoping. We have two blocks written. Suppose this is one block and this is another block. This block is a part of this block. Suppose after this curly bracket, there are some code written. As we know, the blocks are declared with the help of these curly braces. And after this curly bracket, suppose we have some code written. Now the one thing that we need to know is that contents of this block up to this point are visible to the internal block, you can say. Because this block is a part of this outer block. Suppose this outer block is part of this main function. After this main function, this block is written, and here is some code, and inside this main function I have defined another block, and inside this block you have written some code, and I'm trying to access the content of this part over here. Now if we want to access the content over here in this place, then we can do that, because this internal block is a part of this block and the content up to this point is visible to the internal block. That is what we can say. Contents of internal block are not visible to the outer block. Now this is important. The content of this block is not visible to the outside block. If we try to access, suppose, a variable which is declared inside this block, suppose var, over here, then we won't be able to do that, because this variable is declared internally to this block and we won't be able to access that. But here if a variable is declared and if we try to access this variable over this block, we can do that. This is what we need to know and understand. Let's understand this piece of code over here. contents of this block is not visible to any block outside to this block. And we know this thing already. Whatever is declared, whatever is defined inside this block is not visible outside this block, like a main function. Like in the previous example, whatever the content is written over here is not accessible to this function, because this particular block content is not visible to this particular block content. Similarly, in this case as well, this particular block content or this particular block content is not visible outside to any block, you can say. Okay, let's try to differentiate between these two code snippets. Here I have declared and defined a variable var and assigned it a value 3. And here you can see I have declared another variable with same name within the same block. This thing is something which is not allowed at all, right? This is called redefinition of a variable. This is something which is not allowed. You are not allowed to declare or define another variable of same name within the same block, and it will produce an error. That is redefinition of a variable var. Let's try to understand this piece of code and try to differentiate between this and this. Here in this piece of code, also I have defined two variables with same name within the same block. But here the difference is that this variable is declared inside another block, and that is the difference we got over here. This variable lifetime is within this block only, and this is something similar to what we have seen over here, right? Like this is suppose a main function block and this is internal block. If I declare a variable over here that is internal to this block only, this is what we did over here. Now this variable is internal to this block, therefore there is no problem at all. If you want to define two variables with same name but in different blocks, then it is possible. There is no error in this code. This variable is also visible within this block and this variable is internal to this block. Now the next question that I would like to ask you is that what does this printf function will print? Whether this variable content or this variable content. This printf function will prefer a variable which is available immediately to that. You can say if we define a variable internal to this block and we try to access this variable using printf function, then this variable get preference over to this variable. And suppose if this variable is not available, then we are going to access this variable. So this variable get preference over this variable and the value of this is getting printed. Now after this function, or you can say after this block finished, there is another printf function written immediately after that, which is the part of this outer block. Therefore the content it tries to print will take the content of this variable. So the output is 4 and 3. As you can see, output here is 4 and 3. Here in this case you got error because you are redefining within the same block. Here you won't get any error because you are not redefining within same block but within different blocks. Therefore there is no error at all. Let's try to understand this code snippet which is available over here. Here I have defined a prototype of a function. You won't need to bother about it at all right now. We are going to have a lot of discussion on function prototypes, how to define a function, how to call a function. All these things we are going to define when we are going to talk about functions in later lessons. But right now in this lesson, you won't need to bother about it at all. Here you can see I defined a variable var and assigned it a value 10. Now this variable is something special because this variable is outside of all the functions. And this is what we need to know. And therefore it is called a global variable. Calling it a local variable does not make sense because it is not local to any function, you can say. That is why it is called a global variable. Now, the advantage of such a variable is that this variable is available to all the functions, you can say. Like this variable which is declared inside this main function is available within this function only. This variable on the other hand is available to all the functions, or you can say visible to all the functions. Therefore any function if wish to call this variable would be able to call it without any problem. Let's see what does this main function do here. Here you can see I have defined a variable var is equals to 3 and then I'm trying to print the content of this variable. It will simply produce the output is equals to 3. As we know this thing, this variable is local to this function. Therefore, this variable get preference over to this variable. As we know this thing, this variable is also available to this function and also visible to this function. Now compiler would be able to choose that variable which is local to this function and not the one which is outside this function. Therefore, its first preference is this variable, therefore it prints the output is equals to 3. Here in this line, I'm trying to call a function fun. This is the way you call a function. Calling this function means that we are transferring the control from this function to this function. Here inside this function, I used a printf function to print the variable var. Does it produce an error or does it produce some output? This will produce an output because it will access the global variable. This variable is available to this function also, and you know this thing, there is no local variable inside this function. Therefore, compiler will look for a global variable and it will print the contents of this global variable. This is what we call the use of global variable.